Coming up on this episode, the supporting cast in the new show were not bad, but they weren't great either. They were fairly bland. Van Dyke, of course, always has his moments when he's doing his physical comedy.
Strickland, she's up in that cabin with your father. That's a lie. Dirty lie.
Thanks for stopping by. I did not know that. Classic TV edition. Please like and subscribe.
Please stop saying don't forget to like and subscribe.
Sure, but how are we going to get followers?
A while back, I did an episode about the new Andy Griffith show and why it bombed. A viewer suggested I do one on the new Dick Van Dyke Show and why it failed also. The more I thought about it, the more I thought, that was an interesting idea. So that's what we're going to look at in this episode. Probably the two most iconic situation comedies in the 1960s were the Andy Griffith Show and the Dick Van Dyke Show. You can watch these shows 50 years later and they still hold up. I think they're actually still better than almost anything on today. But when both of these stars attempted to do it again in 1971, both of them failed. Griffith pretty badly. We've already talked about why the new Andy Griffith Show failed. For those who might not have caught that episode, I felt a big part of the problem was it was very confusing. In the first episode, it brought back many of the characters that we loved from the original show.
Oh, honey.
Surprise! Surprise! Andy! Why, hey, well, this is a surprise. Look at you. You remember my wife, Lee? Yeah. It can't be. Why, you son of a gun.
You son of a gun yourself.
Now you're a son of a gun.
Yeah, how you doing?
I declare, how did you know I was here?
Are you kidding? I read about it in a Raleigh newspaper.
Goober, Emmett, Howard, and even Barney. But in the new show, Andy wasn't married to Helen Crump. He was married to Lee Merriweather. These old characters knew him as Andy, but he wasn't Andy Taylor. He was Andy Sawyer. What? To make it even more confusing, all these characters were still appearing at the time in the Andy Griffith spin-off show, Mayberry RFD. Talk about the Twilight Zone. Then after that first episode, those classic characters never returned. I think all that confusion in the first show doomed it from the beginning. It premiered in January and was canceled after only 10 episodes in March. The new Dick Van Dyke Show did a bit better than Griffith's show, but it came nowhere close to achieving anything like his classic show did. The new Dick Van Dyke Show premiered in September of 1971, just 6 months after Andy Griffith's big failure. Maybe it learned something from Griffith's failure because it didn't try to bring back any of the regular characters from Van Dyke's classic show. And Van Dyke was now a guy named Dick Preston, not a guy named Rob. In this new series, he played a talk show host. CBS had a lot of faith in Dick Van Dyke and had desperately wanted him back. But he was living in Arizona, and he didn't want to travel back and forth to shoot a series in Hollywood. So CBS agreed to build him a studio and let him shoot the series in Arizona. They also gave him a great time slot. The series aired Saturday nights with Mary Tyler Moore and All in the Family. With a slot like that, it was pretty solid at first. But even at the start, there was a 2-point ratings drop when Van Dyke's new show came on. In hindsight, you have to wonder if it really was a good idea to have his program on right before the Mary Tyler Moore show, since the two were so strongly linked together and Moore's show was already a hit. And then the ratings began to slide in the second season. Hope Lang, who played his wife, was also complaining that she had nothing to do on the show but ask, "How was your day?" The show was in trouble. The network actually considered canceling it and paying off Van Dyke's guaranteed contract. Instead, they moved it to a Monday night after Gunsmoke. Now Dick was no longer a talk show host in Arizona, but an actor in a soap opera. All of the original cast members were dropped, except for Hope Lang and the kids. Some of the new cast members were Richard Dawson from Hogan's Heroes and Dick Van Patten as Dick's boss. The show was still struggling in the third season, but doing a bit better But it was all for nothing. Carl Reiner, who created the original Dick Van Dyke Show and would help at times with the new one, quit permanently after an episode that he'd worked on never aired because CBS felt it was too racy for that type of show. And Dick Van Dyke had had enough also. He said he was done now that his contract is over. The show was dropped. So why then did it fail with such a talent as Dick Van Dyke? One thing I noticed was chemistry, or the lack of it. Getting back to Andy Griffith, part of that appeal was the magic that happened when Griffith and Knotts were together. While it may have been a TV show, they had the same magic when they got together that other great comedy teams had, like Martin and Lewis or Laurel and Hardy. While I don't recall it being written anywhere, in many ways, Van Dyke and Moore had that same kind of comedy team magic, and people felt it. In 1969, the two got back together again for a one-time comedy special, and the magic was still there. It became the highest-rated program on CBS that year.
Welcome. We'd like to welcome you to Dick Van Dyke and the Other Woman. You just want to explain that?
In fact, the chemistry between those two was so strong that for years, many people thought they were married in real life.
Actually, when we were doing the series, people thought we were married.
Oh, boy, so much so that I often had trouble checking into a hotel with my real wife, Margie.
And I had trouble checking into a hotel with my real husband, Grant.
While Hope Lang did a decent job, she wasn't anywhere in the same league as someone like Mary Tyler Moore when it came to comedy or chemistry. You could have plugged in just about any generic actress from that era, like maybe Shirley Jones or June Lockhart, and I think the results probably would have been the same. The original series also had very strong supporting characters: Buddy, Sally, Mel, Alan Brady, the Helpers, and of course Mary Tyler Moore. I was able to find a few of the new Dick Van Dyke Show episodes online, and the supporting cast in the new show were not bad, but they weren't great either. They were fairly bland. Van Dyke, of course, always has his moments when he's doing his physical comedy.
Strickland, she's up in that cabin with your father. That's a lie. Dirty lie.
But the writing and the supporting cast just wasn't strong enough to make you want to stick with it. In one episode I watched from the third season, Dick and Hope's neighbors, played by Richard Dawson and Cheetah Rivera, were hurt when Dick and Hope were invited to a mutual couple's home, and they were not. About midway through, it was pretty obvious that they were trying to recreate the dynamics between the Petries and their neighbors, the Helpers. While it was actually not too bad, the chemistry just wasn't there.
Well, how about you, Dick? Have you finished too?
No, I haven't. I think it's about time this whole thing was brought out in the open.
Yes, let's bring it out in the open, like where you and Jenny were tonight.
Like the famous Thomas Wolfe quote I mentioned in the episode I did on the new Andy Griffith Show, "You really can't go home again." What Dick Van Dyke had with his original situation comedy just couldn't be captured again only a decade after the original show's premiere episode in 1961. It's interesting to consider that while both Griffith and Van Dyke failed in their attempts at comedies after the 1960s, both were able to come back and be very successful in series that were television dramas, where they weren't competing with the ghosts of their past comedic success. Hey, that's it for this episode. I always enjoy looking back at these classic programs, don't you? I enjoy reading your comments, so let me know your thoughts on why you think the new Dick Van Dyke Show failed.
Ba-da-da.